Hello everyone, I am the Midnight Storyteller. I know you clicked on this video to relax for a while or perhaps to let my voice help you fall asleep. Before you do, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you now? And what time is it? Alright, find a comfortable position and relax. There's a unique kind of magic in traditional film photography, a magic entirely lost in the instant gratification of the digital age. It's a deliberate, tactile process. Loading the film in darkness, the satisfying click of the shutter capturing a single moment, and then the quiet alchemy of the darkroom, the anticipation as an image slowly emerges from the chemical bath under the soft, eerie glow of the safe light. My darkroom wasn't much, just a converted pantry off the kitchen, cramped and perpetually smelling faintly of fixer and stop bath. But it was my sanctuary, a place where I felt in control, carefully coaxing images from latent light and silver halides. It was a passion, a meticulous craft, until the craft began to betray me, revealing things unseen, things that should not exist. It started subtly, as most erosions of reality do. I primarily shoot black and white, landscapes mostly. Sometimes street photography. Developing a roll from a trip to the coast, I noticed an anomaly on one print, a landscape of windswept dunes against a gray sky. In the upper right corner, in the expanse of empty sky, there was a faint, irregular smudge, a dark patch that didn't belong. My first thought was dust on the negative, or perhaps a drying mark on the print. But cleaning the negative meticulously and making another print yielded the same result. I examined the negative under magnification. There was a slight density variation, yes, but it didn't look like dust or a scratch. It looked almost organic, like a thumbprint made of shadow. Chemical stain, maybe. I eventually decided, frustrated but not yet alarmed, or a flaw in that particular sheet of film. I filed the print away, slightly annoyed by its imperfection. But it wasn't an isolated incident. On the next roll, a street scene, I noticed something similar, a blurry shape lurking in the deep shadow of a doorway, a shape that hadn't been there when I took the shot. I was sure of it. It was indistinct, barely there, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light or deep grain. Yet it felt intentional, positioned just so. Then, on a portrait of a friend taken in the park, developing the print revealed a faint, almost transparent extra line near his shoulder, like a strap or perhaps a hand, but there was no one else near him. These anomalies started appearing more frequently, 1 or 2 frames per roll, then 3 or 4, always subtle, always deniable on their own. A distortion in the architecture of a familiar building in the background. A face, like pattern emerging from the leaves of a tree, leering out from the grain. An extra, indistinct figure standing far back in a crowd scene, seeming slightly out of focus, slightly wrong. My meticulous process became a source of anxiety. I checked my camera for light leaks, tested different film stocks, varied my developing times and chemical mixtures. The anomalies persisted, independent of any technical variable I could control. They seemed tied not to my process, but to the moments I captured. The darkroom, once my sanctuary, began to feel different. Under the dim, ruby glow of the safe light, the familiar space felt colder than usual, especially near the developing trays. I started feeling watched while I worked, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I'd catch myself glancing nervously into the deeper shadows of the small room, expecting to see something move just beyond the edge of the safe, red light. Sometimes, the familiar sharp scent of the chemicals would be overlaid with something else, a faint, unpleasant metallic tang, almost like old blood, or a damp, stagnant smell like pond water, gone as quickly as I noticed it. The photographs themselves took on a menacing quality. I'd hang the prints up to dry with clothespins on a line strung across the room. My eyes would be drawn, against my will, to the flawed images, The blurry shapes, the distorted faces in the shadows, they began to feel less like random artifacts and more like entities trapped within the emulsion. I started to feel their gaze. Staring at a print with a shadowy anomaly, I'd get the distinct, chilling sensation that the anomaly was aware, looking back at me from its two-dimensional prison. I began storing the bad, prints face down, hidden away in boxes, unable to throw them out but unwilling to look at them. My passion was curdling into dread. Was I losing my mind? Were the chemical fumes finally getting to me? Or was something fundamentally wrong with the light I was capturing, or the reality I was capturing it from? The uncertainty was agonizing. I needed proof. Something undeniable. I decided on a controlled experiment. My apartment had a small spare room, mostly used for storage, which I knew was completely empty at that moment. I set up my large, format camera on a sturdy tripod in the center of the room, carefully composing a shot of the empty space, the blank opposite wall. I locked the room securely from the outside. Using a long cable release fed under the door, I triggered the shutter several times, capturing multiple exposures of the supposedly empty, sealed room. With a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, I took the film holder back to the darkroom. The familiar chemical smells seemed sharper tonight, the red safe light casting deeper, more menacing shadows. My hands trembled slightly as I went through the developing process developer, stop bath, fixer, handling the large negative sheet with painstaking care. I rinsed it, squeegeed it carefully. Then, heart pounding, I placed the wet negative into the enlarger, projected the image onto the easel below, focused meticulously, and exposed a sheet of photographic paper. Back into the trays. Developer stopped bath fixer. Under the dim red light, I watched, holding my breath, as the image slowly materialized on the paper, swimming up from the whiteness. It showed the empty room, just as I expected. The blank wall, the floorboards, the corner where the walls met the ceiling. Perfectly ordinary. Perfectly empty. Relief began to wash over me, until my eyes adjusted further, scanning the details emerging in the grays. Standing against the far wall, partially obscured by shadow but undeniably there, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, seemingly composed of deeper shadow than the surrounding darkness. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid shape, gaunt and slightly stooped. It wasn't a smudge, not a chemical stain, not a light leak. It was clearly depicted theres within the captured scene, an integral part of the developed image of the locked, empty room, and one of its long, shadowy arms was extended slightly, its indistinct fingers reaching, almost touching the surface of the wall, as if testing it, or perhaps preparing to step through it. I snatched the print out of the fixer, hands shaking violently, stumbling backwards, nearly knocking over the trays. Water and chemicals sloshed onto the floor. I fumbled for the main light switch, flooding the small room with harsh white light. I stared down at the print in my trembling hands. The figure was still there, stark black against the gray wall in the photograph, an impossible presence captured on film. That was the end of my darkroom. The magic was gone, replaced by sheer terror. I couldn't bear the thought of coaxing another image into existence, never knowing what hidden horror might emerge alongside it. That night, I dismantled everything. The enlarger, the trays, the timers all packed away into boxes, sealed with tape, relegated to the deepest corner of a storage unit. The chemicals were disposed of, carefully, hazardously. I scrubbed the pantry clean, trying to erase the lingering smell, the lingering presence. I abandoned film photography completely. I switched to digital. The immediacy, the control, the lack of chemical alchemy, it felt safer. Cleaner. For a long time it was. I took pictures, reviewed them instantly on screens, deleted imperfections with a click. The fear began to recede, replaced by the ease of modern technology. But perhaps the phenomenon wasn't tied to the silver and chemicals after all. Perhaps it was tied to something deeper, the act of capturing light, of freezing a moment, or perhaps to me. Lately, I've started noticing things again. Subtle things, easily dismissible, just like before. Reviewing digital photos taken in low light conditions, sometimes the scattered pixels of digital noise seem to coalesce, just for a fraction of a second, into a pattern resembling a distorted face or a leering eye. Editing a photo on my computer, zooming into a shadowed area, I sometimes see shapes that don't belong, forms that flicker at the edge of perception within the pixel grid. Once, during a video call, the feed momentarily glitched, and in the background behind me, where only a blank wall should have been, I saw a brief, impossibly tall, shadowy figure flicker into existence before vanishing as the connection stabilized. The darkroom is gone. The film is gone. But the anomalies persist, having migrated into the sterile, controllable world of digital images. It seems the entity, the presence, the thing that imprinted itself onto my film, wasn't bound to the process. It was bound, perhaps, to the light or to the observer. And now, every time I look at a screen, review a photo, I feel a flicker of that old dread. I find myself searching the shadows, scrutinizing the noise, wondering what unseen figures might be lurking, just beyond the sensor's threshold, waiting patiently to be revealed in the next captured moment, forever haunting the images I create. Shadows are constants, aren't they? Faithful, predictable companions to light and form. They stretch and shrink with the sun's arc, sharpen under harsh bulbs, soften in diffused daylight. They mimic the objects that cast them, negative silhouettes tethered inescapably to their origins. We navigate our world by implicitly trusting this relationship, this simple physics of light and obstruction. My trust in this fundamental reality began to unravel because of the shadow cast by a coat rack. It stood in the corner of my entryway hall, an old wooden thing, inherited with the apartment, tall and slightly spindly with several arms or pegs branching near the top. During the day, sunlight from a nearby window would cast its complex shadow across the floor and onto the opposite wall. At night, the overhead ceiling light created a sharper, more defined silhouette. It was just a shadow, part of the apartment's mundane geography. I first noticed something amiss one late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the hallway floor. I was walking towards the door and glanced at the coat rack's elongated shadow stretching before me, and I paused. Something was wrong. The shadow on the floor seemed too long, longer than the angle of the sun and the height of the coat rack should mathematically allow. And one of the arms of the shadow seemed thicker, more gnarled than the actual wooden peg it represented. I stopped, tilted my head, trying to understand the distortion. Weird angle of light through the window, I reasoned. Maybe a warp in the old floorboards distorting the perspective. I walked closer, blocking the light momentarily, then stepped aside. The shadow reappeared, still subtly incorrect. I even touched the coat rack, ran my hand along the peg, casting the wrong shadow arm. It was perfectly normal, smooth wood. Shaking my head at my own over-observation, I dismissed it. But once noticed, it became harder to ignore. I started paying more attention to the coat rack's shadow, both day and night. Under the consistent overhead light at night, the discrepancy was less about length and more about detail. The shadow sometimes seemed sharper, more defined than the slightly worn edges of the coat rack itself should produce. Other times, it seemed that tiny details, a hook, a joint, were missing from the shadow, or conversely, the shadow included a faint bulge or spike that had no corresponding feature on the object. Then came the movement, or rather, Lee's impression of movement. It was incredibly subtle, the kind of thing you'd absolutely convince yourself you hadn't seen. Staring at the shadow cast on the wall under the steady ceiling light, sometimes I thought I saw its edges flicker. Not a flicker caused by the light source, which was stable, but an intrinsic quiver within the darkness itself. Other times, the very tip of the shadow, where the highest peg cast its silhouette, seemed to creep. An almost imperceptible crawl, maybe an inch over the span of 10 minutes, independent of any change in light or the object's position. And perhaps most disturbingly, sometimes the base of the shadow, where it met the floor and connected to the base of the physical coat rack, seemed to momentarily detach. A tiny, hair-thin line of normally lit wall would appear for a fraction of a second between the object and its shadow, before snapping back together. It was like a brief, silent stutter in reality's projection. My rational mind fought fiercely. My eyes are tired. It's an optical illusion caused by micro vibrations in the building. I'm projecting movement onto a static image because I'm stressed. I tried experiments. I moved the coat rack to a different corner of the hall. For a day, its shadow behaved perfectly normally, conforming precisely to its shape and the light. Relief washed over me. Then, slowly, subtly, the discrepancies returned, the slight elongation, the occasional flicker, the momentary detachment at the base. It wasn't the location. It was the shadow itself. I changed the light bulb in the hallway fixture brighter, dimmer, different color temperatures. It made no difference to the shadow's independent anomalies. I tried placing another object, like a tall lamp, beside the coat rack, letting their shadows merge. The lamp's shadow behaved perfectly, a faithful silhouette. But within the combined darkness, the coat rack's portion still seemed subtly wrong, its edges sometimes unnaturally sharp against the lamp's softer shadow, its independent flicker occasionally visible within the larger patch of darkness. A new sensory detail emerged. The area of the wall and floor covered by this specific shadow felt cold. Not just lacking the warmth of direct light, but a distinct, localized chill. Walking through that patch of shadow felt like stepping through a cold curtain that wasn't there. I'd feel goosebumps rise on my arms, a shiver tracing down my spine, specifically and only when passing through that particular shadowed space. Other shadows in the hallway felt neutral, just absences of light. This one felt like an absence of heat as well. The feeling of being watched, which had started as a general unease, began to crystallize, focusing on that corner, on that shadow. It felt aware. I started catching glimpses, out of the very corner of my eye, of the shadow seeming to stretch around the edge of the doorway leading into the living room, as if it were trying to peek beyond its physical limitations. The moment I turned my head to look directly, it would be gone, confined to its proper place. But the impression lingered, the chilling suggestion of hidden observation emanating from a patch of darkness. My behavior became increasingly paranoid. I avoided walking through the shadow space. I found myself constantly monitoring it, cataloging its subtle shifts and flickers. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake, imagining the shadow detaching completely in the darkness, silently exploring the apartment. The fundamental, reliable nature of light and shadow, something I had never consciously considered before, now felt fragile, untrustworthy. If a shadow could behave wrongly, what else could? The climax arrived during an unexpected power outage one stormy evening. The wind howled outside, rain lashed against the windows, and then, with a sudden clunk, the entire apartment plunged into darkness. No lights, no hum of appliances, just the sound of the storm and the pounding of my own heart. Emergency lights in the building stairwell cast only the faintest, most indirect glow into my hallway. My eyes slowly adjusted to the profound darkness. Shapes were barely discernible, the faint outline of furniture, the slightly less black rectangle of the window. I instinctively looked towards the corner where the coat rack stood. I could just make out its tall, spindly form against the slightly lighter wall. But where its shadow should have been, there was nothing. No, that's not right. There was darkness, of course, the entire room was dark. But in the specific area where the coat rack's shadow usually fell, the darkness seemed deeper, more absolute. A patch of velvety, non-reflective blackness that stood out even against the general gloom, shaped vaguely like the familiar silhouette but somehow separate. And then it moved. Slowly, silently, this patch of deeper darkness, this uncoupled shadow, began to peel away from the wall near the base of the coat rack. It maintained its vague, elongated shape, but it lifted off the surface, becoming a free, floating plane of pure blackness within the darkened room. It drifted weightlessly across the wall, moving with a slow, deliberate steadiness towards me. There was no sound, no change in temperature that I could detect in my terror. Just this impossible sight, a piece of shadow, untethered from its origin, moving with independent volition through the dark room. It felt ancient, alien, a violation of fundamental physics. My breath hitched. I was frozen, unable to scream, unable to move, watching this two-dimensional void drift closer. It was perhaps halfway across the wall, an arm's length away, its deeper blackness seeming to absorb even the faint ambient light. When suddenly, with a flicker and a surge, the power came back on. The overhead light flooded the hallway with brilliance, and the shadow, it was instantly, violently snapped back into place, perfectly aligned with the coat rack, sharp, edged under the bright light, looking completely normal, utterly mundane, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just been gliding across my wall like a sentient void. The shock left me trembling, gasping for air. The proof was undeniable, witnessed in the stark vulnerability of the blackout. The shadow wasn't just wrong, it was, or could be, independent. Alive in some incomprehensible way. I didn't sleep in the apartment that night. The next day, I removed the coat rack. I didn't sell it or give it away. I took it apart, piece by piece, and disposed of it far from my home. I then rearranged the entire hallway, moving the lamp, ensuring no large, distinct shadows were cast in that corner or anywhere prominent. I installed brighter light bulbs. The specific rogue shadow is gone. The intense cold spot vanished with it. But I am irrevocably changed. I can no longer perceive shadows as simple absences of light. Every shadow now holds a flicker of potential menace. I find myself constantly scrutinizing the way light falls, the shapes darkness takes under furniture, in corners, behind curtains. Is that shadow moving slightly? Is its edge too sharp? Is it darker than it should be? I live in brightly lit rooms now, often leaving lights on even during the day. I've become wary of twilight, of cloudy days, of any situation where shadows grow long and deep. The fear isn't focused on one object anymore. It's generalized to the very interplay of light and dark itself. Because I know now, with chilling certainty, that sometimes, in the right conditions, or perhaps when something ancient stirs shadows, might not stay tethered to the world that casts them. And the darkness might just decide to move on its own. I've always prided myself on my memory, on my awareness of my own passage through time. I keep a detailed schedule, make meticulous notes, track my appointments and commitments. My life, while perhaps not thrilling, has always felt accounted for. I knew where I was, what I'd done, the conversations I'd had. My own sense of self, anchored in the continuity of my experiences, felt solid, reliable, until recently. Now that anchor is dragging and the solid ground feels increasingly like shifting sand. It began innocuously enough with minor social discrepancies. A colleague, Dave from accounting, clapped me on the shoulder by the coffee machine one morning. "Hey," he said cheerfully, "saw you buried in that report down in the archives yesterday afternoon. Looked like you were really wrestling with those figures." I smiled politely but felt a flicker of confusion. Yesterday afternoon. Dave, I haven't been down to the archives in weeks. I was in back-to-back meetings until 6. He frowned, shook his head. Weird. Could have sworn it was you. Looked right at you. He shrugged and walked away, leaving me feeling vaguely unsettled. Someone who looked like me. Okay, possible. A few days later, I bumped into my friend Sarah at the grocery store. "Oh," she said. "Sorry I missed your call earlier." My phone was on silent. What was up? I blinked. My call? "Sarah, I haven't called you today. She pulled out her phone, showed me her recent call log. There it was, my name, my number, logged about an hour earlier, marked as a missed call. I stared at it, feeling a cold prickle run down my spine. I knew I hadn't called her. My own phone log showed no outgoing call at that time. That's really strange, I stammered. We both awkwardly dismissed it as a network glitch, but the incident lingered in my mind. These external reports, people seeing me where I wasn't or referencing interactions I didn't recall, started accumulating. A neighbor mentioning they saw me get a package delivery I never received. My sister referencing a specific point I supposedly made in a phone conversation we definitely hadn't had. Each time, I'd politely correct them, feeling increasingly flustered, increasingly certain that they were mistaken. It was easier to believe in multiple small errors on their part than one large, impossible error on mine. But then, the discrepancies started appearing in my own space, within the locked sanctuary of my apartment. Things I couldn't attribute to anyone else's faulty memory. I'd wake up in the morning and find the dishwasher, which I distinctly remembered leaving full of dirty dishes the night before, completely empty. The dishes clean and stacked neatly in the drying rack. I live alone. Who else could have done it? Had I gotten up in the middle of the night and done it while half asleep, with no recollection? It seemed unlikely, given my usually deep sleep. Other things followed. Finding a half-finished cup of tea on the kitchen counter, still slightly warm, when I hadn't made tea that morning. Discovering a new email sitting in my drafts folder, a reply to a complex work query, written entirely in my style, using my usual phrasing, referencing points from the original email, but I had absolutely no memory of starting it, let alone thinking through the response. It was as if another me had sat down, worked for 10 minutes, then simply vanished, leaving the task unfinished. The feeling of lost time began to manifest more overtly. It wasn't just forgetting minor actions. It was chunks of my day unaccounted for. I'd be sitting at my desk working, glance at the clock, 20:15 p.m., become absorbed in a task, look up again feeling like only a few minutes had passed, and the clock would read 4:00 p.m. Nearly 2 hours gone, with no clear memory of what I'd accomplished, just a vague sense of having been occupied. Or I'd leave the house intending to run a quick errand, expecting to be gone 20 minutes, and arrive back finding over an hour had inexplicably passed. The errand completed, but the journey itself a confusing blur in my memory. These gaps weren't like simply zoning out. They felt seamless. Like part of my consciousness was simply edited out, leaving me to pick up moments or hours later, feeling disoriented and deeply unnerved. Was I experiencing blackouts? Fugue states? Was this a medical issue? I booked a doctor's appointment, my anxiety mounting. Around this time, I started catching glimpses, fleeting, peripheral sightings that defied logic. Walking down a busy street, I'd see my own reflection in a large shop window, but the reflection would be turning to look into the shop while I was walking straight past it. Or I'd be waiting at a traffic light and see, in the reflection of the polished side of the bus beside me, someone who looked exactly like me, standing on the opposite corner, looking impatient. These weren't just reflections, they were reflections doing other different things, being in different places. They lasted only a fraction of a second. By the time I did a double take, the reflection was normal, or the bus had moved on. But the jolt of seeing myself misplaced was profoundly disturbing. My digital life echoed the physical discrepancies. I started receiving replies to emails or text messages I had no memory of sending, usually innocuous enough, confirmations of appointments I didn't recall making, replies to questions I didn't remember asking. Checking my sent folders confirmed the messages originated from my accounts, written in my style, but the act of composing and sending them was completely absent from my memory. It felt like a subtle form of gaslighting, perpetrated by myself. The doctor found nothing physically wrong. Basic cognitive tests came back normal. He suggested stress, lack of sleep, advised I monitor the situation, maybe keep a detailed journal. The journal became my obsession. I started documenting everything: where I went, who I spoke to, what I did, trying to create an unshakable record of my own timeline, cross-referencing it constantly with my phone's location history, my emails, my receipts. I needed proof that the my version of reality was the correct one. But the journal only highlighted the inconsistencies. Entries would sometimes feel thin, lacking detail for certain periods, and the external contradictions continued. My carefully constructed timeline felt increasingly fragile, riddled with inexplicable gaps and contradictory data points. The fear shifted from worrying about my health to something deeper, more existential. Who was I, if I couldn't trust my own presence in time and space? What was happening during those lost hours? Who was sending those emails, unloading the dishwasher, being seen across town? The climax, when it arrived, wasn't a confrontation, but a quiet, chilling confirmation. I came home one evening after work, feeling particularly drained and disoriented after a day where several small glitches had occurred. I unlocked my apartment door, stepped inside. The air felt still, different somehow. On the small table by the entryway, where I usually drop my keys, sat a coffee mug, one of my own mugs. It was half full. I touched it tentatively. Still warm, steam curled faintly from the surface. I hadn't made coffee since early that morning. My gaze fell on a notepad next to the mug. A single sheet was torn off, resting on top. Written on it, unmistakably in my handwriting, were 3 short, cryptic lines. She called again. Under the railway bridge. Midnight. Don't forget the gloves. I stared at the note, my blood turning to ice. My handwriting, my notepad. But the message meant absolutely nothing to me. Who called? What bridge? Why gloves? It felt like reading a page from someone else's secret life, terrifyingly rendered in my own script. Just then, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment door, followed by a cheerful voice. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, from across the hall, probably coming back from walking her dog. I quickly opened the door again, needing a moment of normal interaction, needing to escape the chilling atmosphere inside. "Oh, hello," she said, smiling. "Back out again so soon. I just saw you go inside not 2 minutes ago." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I must have swayed because her smile faltered, replaced by a look of concern. "Are you all right, dear? You look pale as a ghost." I mumbled something incoherent, managed a weak smile, and quickly retreated back into my apartment, shutting the door, locking it, leaning heavily against it. Not 2 minutes ago. The warm coffee, the note, my handwriting. Another me had been here, physically present just moments before I arrived. Had walked these floors, written that note, perhaps looked out this window. Had existed concurrently, or perhaps sequentially, occupying the spaces my own memory couldn't account for. I slid down the door, sitting on the floor, head in my hands, trembling. There was no escaping it now. I wasn't just losing time. I was apparently sharing my life, my space, my identity with something else. A doppelganger, a split personality manifesting physically, a temporal echo. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants, what it does during those borrowed hours, what meeting it might entail. I live now in a state of hyper-vigilance, constantly checking my reflection, questioning my memories, scrutinizing my own handwriting. I leave myself time-stamped notes, take constant photos, desperately trying to anchor myself to prove my own continuity. But the gaps persist. The glimpses continue. The fear is constant. The fear that one day I might come home and find the door locked from the inside. Or that I might look in the mirror and see the other one looking back, no longer a fleeting reflection, but fully present, ready to take over completely, leaving me lost in the stolen minutes and borrowed time. Living in an older apartment building comes with its own peculiar soundtrack. The sigh of steam radiators, the groan of floorboards under unseen footsteps from the unit above, the occasional clatter of pipes in the walls. You learn to filter it out, mostly. It becomes background noise, the ambient murmur of a shared structure settling into its bones. But the dripping sound that started in my bedroom ceiling a few months ago, that was different. It refused to be ignored. It burrowed under my skin. It began subtly, as these intrusions often do. Lying in bed one rainy Tuesday night, I became aware of a faint, irregular plip-plip sound. Not the steady rhythm of a faucet leak, but erratic, inconsistent. Plip, plop, plip. I assumed it was rain finding its way into a hidden gutter outside, or maybe something dripping onto the roof above my top-floor apartment. Annoying, but understandable given the downpour. Except, the sound didn't stop when the rain did. It persisted on dry nights, a quiet, random punctuation in the silence. Plip-plop, it seemed to be coming from the ceiling, somewhere above the foot of my bed. I'd get up, turn on the light, stare intently at the smooth, unremarkable white plaster. Nothing. No visible dampness, no cracks, no sign of moisture whatsoever. I checked the bathroom next door, no leaks. I even, somewhat embarrassingly, climbed onto a chair to press my ear against the ceiling. I couldn't pinpoint the exact source. The sound seemed diffuse, yet definitely originating from up there. Over the next few weeks, the sound became a nightly companion, sometimes fading almost entirely, other times becoming more insistent, and frustratingly, its perceived location seemed to shift. One night, it sounded like it was directly overhead. The next, it seemed closer to the window. A few days later, nearer the closet. This mobility made it even harder to dismiss as a simple structural issue. It felt elusive then. I noticed the stain. It wasn't there one day, and the next it was. A small, faint discoloration on the pristine white plaster, roughly in the area where the dripping sound seemed most frequent that week. It was pale yellow, barely larger than a coin, the kind of watermark that old buildings often acquire. Condensation, maybe? I thought, though the room wasn't particularly humid, or a remnant of an old leak finally showing through the new paint. I tried wiping at it gently. It didn't budge. It was in the plaster. I called building maintenance. A weary-looking man came, tapped the ceiling, shone a flashlight, grumbled about humidity levels, and declared it was likely just an old stain resurfacing, or maybe condensation from the roof space. Nothing structural. Nothing to worry about. He couldn't hear any dripping. Of course, it was daytime. I felt foolish, overly anxious, but the faint plip-plop returned that night, right on schedule, and the stain began to grow. Slowly, relentlessly, week by week. Its edges crept outwards like a sluggish amoeba. The color deepened, shifting from pale yellow to a sickly beige, then to an undeniable, worrying shade of brown, like weak tea spilled and left to dry. It was no longer a small mark. It was a noticeable patch, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, sprawling across the ceiling above my bed. The dripping sound also began to change occasionally. Sometimes, mixed in with the erratic watery plips, there would be a thicker, heavier sound. A soft gloop or a wet splut, like something more viscous than water hitting a surface. These sounds were particularly unsettling, making my stomach churn, my mind conjuring unpleasant images of what might be accumulating above the plaster. I escalated my complaints to the building management, showing them photos of the growing stain. They sent another maintenance worker, who grudgingly cut a small inspection hole near the edge of the stain. He peered inside with a flashlight, reported finding nothing, no active leak, no sodden insulation, no sign of pests, just old joists and dust. He patched the hole, slapped some paint over the stain, slightly mismatched shade of white, of course it, and told me it was probably just residual moisture from years ago finally working its way out. The paint barely masked the stain, its darker edges still visible beneath the thin coat. And within days, the brown discoloration began to bleed through the new paint, reclaiming its territory. The dripping sound continued, its location still shifting slightly night after night. My anxiety grew into a constant thrum. Lying in bed, I found myself staring up at the ceiling, fixated on the ugly brown map spreading above me, listening to the erratic ploop, gloop, plop, feeling helpless and increasingly disgusted. What was up there? If it wasn't water, What could cause such a persistent sound and a growing, darkening stain? The color shifted again, slowly, over another week or two. The brown took on a darker, reddish hue. Like rust, perhaps? Or something else. Something that made my blood run cold whenever I looked at it. It wasn't bright red, but a deep, brownish burgundy, the color of old, dried blood. The sight filled me with a primal revulsion. My mind concocted horrifying scenarios, a long-forgotten tragedy in the attic space. A slow leak from something unimaginable hidden between the floors. The rational part of me knew these thoughts were likely irrational, fueled by fear and lack of explanation. But the visual evidence was right there, staining my ceiling, dripping its irregular rhythm into my sleepless nights. My sleep became fragmented, haunted. I'd wake frequently, instantly attuned to the dripping sound, my eyes snapping open, staring into the darkness towards the ceiling. I felt vulnerable, lying directly beneath it. I started having nightmares, not specific scenes, but oppressive feelings of decay, of something heavy and rotten pressing down from above, of drowning in thick, dark liquid. The climax arrived with sickening finality. I was jolted awake around 3 a.m., not by the usual faint dripping, but by a sound that was loud, insistent, and horribly close. It sounded like it was happening right above my head. Splat. Splat. A thick, viscous, heavy dripping sound. Heart pounding, choking back a wave of nausea. I fumbled for the bedside lamp and switched it on. I forced myself to look up. The stain was different. It dominated the ceiling now, a large, irregular shape, darker than ever, almost black at its center, but with edges that glistened wetly in the lamplight, tinged a horrifying deep red, and it was actively dripping. Not water. From the very center of the stain, defying gravity, defying the seemingly dry plaster around it, a thick, dark, syrupy fluid was oozing and gathering, forming heavy, pendulous drops that fell with a sickening thwack onto my duvet cover below. I scrambled out of bed with a cry of disgust, stumbling backwards, staring up in horror. The dark fluid continued to drip, thick and slow, leaving dark, rapidly spreading spots on my bedding. The air filled with a faint coppery, slightly sweet smell, like rust and rot combined. It wasn't just a leak. It felt like the ceiling itself was weeping some foul, unknown substance. I couldn't stay in the room. I couldn't sleep under that. I dragged my mattress into the living room that night, leaving a plastic bucket on the floor beneath the dripping stain. By morning, the dripping had slowed, then stopped. The bucket contained about half an inch of the dark, viscous, reddish-brown fluid. I disposed of it down the toilet, scrubbing the bucket frantically afterwards, feeling contaminated. Management came again, looked baffled, blamed humidity, patched the ceiling again, more inexpertly this time, painted over the stain again. But the stain remains, a permanent, ugly scar on the ceiling, faintly visible beneath the paint. And though the active dripping hasn't returned with such intensity, the sounds haven't stopped entirely. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The faint, erratic plip-plop, or sometimes, the thicker gloop. And now it doesn't always seem to come from the original spot. Sometimes I hear it faintly from the corner near the window. Sometimes near the closet, as if the source, whatever decaying, unknown thing festers in the space above me, is slowly, persistently, continuing to soak through, searching for new places to weep its essence into my home. I live beneath it, listening, waiting, forever dreading the next drip and the true, horrifying nature of what lies hidden just inches above my head. This house breathes at night. All old houses do, I suppose. They settle and sigh, timbers contracting in the cool air, pipes ticking, the wind finding small imperfections in the window frames to whisper through. I've always found a certain comfort in these sounds, the gentle symphony of a structure at rest. They were familiar, predictable. Unlike the other sound, the one that started a few months after I moved in. The one that only happens when the house is at its quietest, and I am at my most still. My bedroom is on the ground floor, a cozy enough space with one window looking out onto the darkened garden. Directly above it lies the attic, or rather, just an unfinished storage space spanning the length of this older wing of the house. I know this because I checked shortly after moving and dragging down the folding ladder, poking my head up into a world of thick dust, cobwebs stretching like ghostly lace between rough wooden beams, and the faint, dry smell of aged timber and insulation. It's cramped, low, ceilinged, accessible only from the hallway. It's meant to be empty, save for perhaps forgotten Christmas decorations or the ghosts of insulation fibers dancing in flashlight beams. It is certainly not meant for walking, which is why the sound, when I first heard it, was so confusing, so easy to initially dismiss. I was lying in bed, hovering in that liminal space just before sleep, the house profoundly silent around me. Then, faintly, from the ceiling directly above thud, a long pause, long enough for me to almost dismiss it. Then thud, another pause, measured, deliberate. Thud, it was incredibly soft. Not a sharp rap or a heavy tread, but a dull, muted impact like the sound of a bare foot, or perhaps a foot clad in a thick sock, stepping carefully onto a dusty floorboard directly overhead. My first thought was logical, rational. A branch from the old oak tree outside, scraping rhythmically against the roof shingles in a breeze I couldn't feel. Or maybe a squirrel or raccoon had somehow found its way into the attic space, its movements muffled by the insulation. I listened intently, holding my breath. Thud, pause, thud, pause. The rhythm was too slow, too methodical for an animal, too regular for branches in an inconsistent breeze. It sounded, quite distinctly, like someone pacing, slowly, deliberately, back and forth directly above my bed. I strained my ears, trying to follow the sound's path. It seemed to travel from roughly above the head of my bed, move slowly towards the foot, pause, and then return just as slowly. A short, confined circuit repeated over and over. It was deeply unsettling, but exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted off, convincing myself it was just the house playing tricks, sounds carrying strangely through the old structure. But it wasn't a one-time event. It returned the next night, and the night after that. It became a fixture of the late hours, usually starting sometime after midnight, once the house had fully settled into silence. Always the same. The faint, soft, incredibly slow thud, pause, pacing back and forth in that narrow path on the ceiling above my bed. The sound itself wasn't loud enough to truly prevent sleep. Not initially. It was the implication that was eroding my peace. The knowledge that someone was seemingly moving around in the sealed, empty space directly overhead. The sheer impossibility of it gnawed at me. During the daylight hours, the attic remained stubbornly silent. Fueled by a mixture of frustration and creeping fear, I made several more thorough daytime inspections. I took a powerful flashlight and a dust mask, climbed the rickety ladder, and systematically examined every inch of the space directly above my bedroom. The floorboards were thick with dust, gray and undisturbed, except for the faint outlines of my own previous footprints from earlier checks. There were no other tracks, no signs of animal intrusion, no droppings, no nests, no chewed wires. I checked the eaves from outside, looked for any broken vents or loose soffits where something could conceivably get in. Nothing. The space was sealed, dusty, and definitively empty of any living creature large enough to make footsteps. Standing there in the dusty silence of the attic, knowing what I heard each night directly below these very floorboards, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Where did the sound come from? I started noticing another layer to the phenomenon. The footsteps only seemed to occur when I was actually in bed, preparing for sleep, or lying awake in the darkness. If I got up, turned on the light, walked around my room, the sounds from above would cease. Utterly. If I sat up reading, they remained silent. Only when I lay down, settled into stillness, attempting to sleep, would the slow, soft pacing overhead eventually resume. It felt responsive, as if it waited for me to be still, vulnerable, before beginning its nightly patrol. This realization added a disturbing layer of perceived awareness. of being specifically monitored. Sometimes, very faintly, I thought I heard another sound accompanying the footsteps, a barely audible rustle, like the whisper of old, dry fabric brushing lightly against wood, occurring just after each soft thud. It was inconsistent, hard to be sure of, but it added to the impression of someone clothed, walking carefully in the darkness above. The psychological toll began to mount. Lying in bed ceased to be restful. Instead, it became a state of hyper-awareness, every nerve straining to listen to the ceiling. I'd stare upwards into the darkness, tracking the invisible path of the footsteps, my muscles tensed, my breathing shallow. The feeling of vulnerability was immense, lying there, exposed, directly beneath whatever paced methodically back and forth. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by periods of anxious listening. The quiet itself became threatening, a canvas upon which the soft footsteps would inevitably begin their slow performance. I tried playing white noise to mask the sound, but it didn't work. My ears seemed to tune into that specific frequency, that specific rhythm, filtering it through the static or the simulated rain sounds. I tried sleeping with headphones on, listening to music or podcasts, but the feeling of vulnerability, of not being able to hear my immediate surroundings, created its own anxiety. I considered moving my bed to a different part of the room. But some morbid, perhaps foolish, part of me resisted. This was my room, my space. I wouldn't be driven from my own bed by what? Footsteps made of silence and dust. Then came the night that solidified the dread into something colder, sharper. The footsteps had started as usual, slow, soft, rhythmic. Thud, pause, thud, pacing their familiar road above me. I was lying perfectly still, eyes wide open in the dark, listening, my body rigid with the now familiar tension. The footsteps reached the point on the ceiling directly above my pillow, directly above my head, and they stopped. Not faded out, not paused in rhythm, but stopped mid-path. The silence that followed was abrupt, heavy, more profound than the usual pauses between steps. I held my breath, every muscle tensed, waiting. What now? Then, from the plaster ceiling directly above my face, came a new sound. It wasn't loud, but it felt incredibly intimate, terrifyingly close. A faint, dry, protracted cree-ee-ee-ee-eek. The sound of old wood under immense, slowly applied pressure. Or perhaps, the sound of plaster beginning to give way, very, very slowly. It lasted for several seconds, a drawn-out, granular sigh from the very structure above me. It felt undeniably like something heavy was settling its weight, or deliberately, gently, pressing down, right there, just inches above my head. My heart felt like it stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, convinced the ceiling was about to splinter, that something was about to descend. The creaking sound slowly faded into silence. Another moment of absolute stillness passed, stretching into an eternity. Then thud. The footsteps resumed, softly, slowly, deliberately, moving away from directly overhead, continuing their familiar path towards the foot of the bed, then turning, pacing back. The rhythm re-established itself, methodical, unhurried. After completing one more circuit, the footsteps gradually faded away into silence, as they often did towards the early morning hours. I lay there for perhaps an hour, maybe longer, completely frozen, drenched in cold sweat. The terror wasn't just from the sound, but from the implication, the pressure, the weight, the focused attention directly overhead. I couldn't stay there. As soon as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, I scrambled out of bed, gathered my duvet and pillow, and retreated to the living room sofa. I haven't slept in the bedroom since. I keep the door closed. Sometimes I think about moving the bed, trying again, reclaiming the space. But the memory of that creak, the feeling of that slow, deliberate pressure from above, is too strong. I sleep fitfully on the sofa now, or sometimes in the small guest room at the other end of the house. I often leave a light on in the hallway. It seems to help. The footsteps rarely, if ever, occur when there's light filtering under the bedroom door. But sometimes on the very quietest nights, when the whole world seems asleep, I think I can still hear it, even from the living room. A faint, muffled echo, traveling through the old bones of the house. Thud pause, thud, the slow, deliberate pacing from the empty room above my abandoned bed. It's quieter now, more distant, but it's there. A patient, persistent reminder of the unseen presence that walks silently in the darkness just above, forever tracing its narrow path, waiting in the dust. There is a particular quality to the silence of a very old library after hours. It's not just an absence of noise, it's a presence in itself, thick with the weight of accumulated knowledge, whispered histories, and the phantom rustle of countless turned pages. The Sterling Memorial Library, where I spent many evenings volunteering, was such a place. Built in the late 19th century, its cavernous reading rooms echoed with footsteps during the day, but after the heavy oak doors were locked, a profound hush descended, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the main hall and the occasional sigh of the ancient heating system. My task was simple, if painstaking, carefully restoring bindings on brittle, centuries-old books in a small, secluded workroom off the main stacks. I often stayed late, finding the deep quiet conducive to the delicate work. The library itself is a labyrinth of towering wooden shelves, reaching towards high, vaulted ceilings, narrow aisles disappearing into shadow, and unexpected reading alcoves tucked away like hidden chapels. The air perpetually smells of aging paper, crumbling leather, beeswax polish, and dust, a scent I've always found deeply comforting, the perfume of time itself. I felt privileged to work there, surrounded by the sleeping thoughts of generations. It was during one of these late sessions, perhaps my third or fourth week volunteering, that I first became aware of the hum. I was deep in the frequented Epsilon Wing, searching for a specific reference volume amongst shelves dedicated to local county histories. The only light came from the small desk lamp I carried, and the low, wattage safety bulbs spaced far apart along the ceiling, casting pools of weak light separated by vast stretches of gloom. The silence was absolute, and then I noticed it. A very low, almost sub-audible hum. It wasn't the buzz of the old fluorescent lights, they were mostly off in this section. It wasn't the distant furnace or any ventilation system I could identify. It was a continuous, steady drone, more a vibration felt in the soles of my feet and the bones of my inner ear than a distinct sound. It seemed to have no specific source, yet it permeated the air around me in that particular aisle. My first thought was building resonance, perhaps from a transformer somewhere deep in the basement, its frequency traveling strangely through the old structure. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the titles before me. But the hum persisted, a constant, low thrum beneath the silence. When I moved to the next aisle over, searching for my book, the hum faded almost completely. Curious, I stepped back into the previous aisle. There it was again, that faint, pervasive vibration in the air. Strange. Over the following weeks, I became more attuned to it. It wasn't present everywhere in the library after hours, but it seemed concentrated in certain areas, particularly the older wings containing local history, genealogy records, and some of the more obscure, seldom requested collections. And I began to notice something else. The hum didn't always feel the same. Sometimes it was just a flat, neutral drone. But other times, especially when I paused near a shelf containing, say, records of 19th century mill workers or town meeting minutes from decades past, the pitch seemed to subtly modulate, rising almost imperceptibly, as if in curiosity. Then again, in the aisle dedicated to local tragedies, accounts of fires, floods, forgotten epidemics, the hum often felt lower, deeper, carrying an almost palpable sense of melancholy. It was utterly bizarre, and I repeatedly told myself I was anthropomorphizing a simple resonance, projecting meaning onto random fluctuations. Yet, the feeling accompanying the hum was undeniable. It wasn't menacing or frightening. Not then. It felt like a presence. Quiet, focused, intensely scholarly, perhaps a little sad. Like the phantom echo of a long, departed librarian still diligently overseeing their domain. The thought was fanciful, of course, but oddly comforting in the vast, lonely silence. Then I started noticing the books. In the aisles where the hum was most distinct, occasionally I would find a single volume pulled slightly out from the tightly packed shelf. Not fallen, not drastically misplaced, just protruding by an inch or so, as if someone had briefly considered it, perhaps touched its spine, and then moved on. I gently push it back flush with the others, noting the title. Often, they were books directly related to the perceived mood of the hum in that area, a genealogy tracing a family lost to disease, a detailed account of a historic downtown fire, a collection of local folklore mentioning strange occurrences in the nearby woods. It felt less like a disturbance and more like research notes left by an invisible hand. The air in these humming sections also felt consistently cooler than the rest of the library, a dry, noticeable chill that raised goosebumps on my arms and made the old papers smell sharper, cleaner. It wasn't a draft, just a localized drop in temperature that coincided perfectly with the presence of the hum. My feelings began to shift from mild curiosity to a deeper unease. The gentle, scholarly presence started to feel persistent. The coincidences, the specific books, the mood-inflected hum piled up, challenging my attempts at rationalization. I began to feel like less of an observer and more like an intruder. As if my late, night presence in these quiet aisles was disturbing a long, solitary vigil. I started working more quickly when I had to venture into the Epsilon wing or the older archives, the comforting silence now tinged with a feeling of being politely, but firmly observed. One night, I needed a particular volume of local church records from the 1800s, housed in a notoriously remote and dusty dead-end alcove at the far end of the third-floor stacks. I hadn't been back there in months. As I navigated the narrow, dimly lit aisles, the familiar low hum became increasingly prominent, stronger than I'd ever heard it before. It seemed to thrum up from the very floorboards, resonating in my chest. The air grew noticeably colder, my breath pluming slightly in the beam of my flashlight. The hum led me directly to the alcove. It was a small, cramped space, barely wide enough for one person-lined floor, to ceiling with towering shelves of crumbling ledgers and forgotten manuscripts. In the center stood a single, heavy, dark oak reading stand, thick with dust except for its slanted top surface, and resting upon the stand, open, lay a large, exceptionally old book. Its leather cover was cracked and peeling, the spine reinforced with faded tape. The pages visible were thick, yellowed parchment, covered in dense, spidery, handwritten script in faded brown ink. The air around the stand vibrated intensely with the low hum. It was undeniably the source. I approached cautiously, flashlight beam focused on the open book. The script was archaic, difficult to decipher. As I leaned closer, trying to make out the words, I saw it happen. The right-hand page, brittle and ancient, lifted slowly, deliberately, as if turned by an unseen finger. It settled softly onto the page beneath it, revealing a new spread of dense, archaic text. There was no draft in the alcove, not the slightest breath of air movement. The page turned with a quiet, dry rustle that was somehow louder than the pervasive hum. I froze, mesmerized, a wave of cold dread washing over me, colder even than the air in the alcove. The hum continued, steady and deep, seeming to emanate from the very pages, the very ink itself. Another page began to lift, driven by a sudden jolt of fear mixed with an almost academic reflex. I reached out, my hand trembling, intending to what? Stop the page, touch the script. The instant my fingers came within an inch of the parchment, the book slammed shut. Not violently, but with a soft, decisive thump that echoed in the tiny space, sending up a small puff of ancient dust that danced in my flashlight beam. And the hum stopped. Instantly. The silence that crashed down was absolute, deafening. The coldness in the alcove seemed to lessen slightly, the heavy presence receding. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, staring at the closed, silent book on the stand. Then I turned and fled, stumbling back through the dark, silent aisles, not stopping until I reached the main hall, the reassuring tick of the grandfather clock, and the heavy oak doors leading outside, I didn't return to the library for several days. When I did, I stuck strictly to my workroom in the main, lit areas, avoiding the older wings entirely. I never heard the hum in the library again. I finished my volunteer project quickly and found reasons not to stay late anymore. I thought, perhaps hoped, that the experience was tied to that specific place, that ancient building steeped in history and silence. But sometimes now, when I'm at home, late at night, reading in the quiet solitude of my own apartment, I hear it, very faintly, almost imperceptibly. That same low, steady hum. It seems to emanate from the book I'm holding, or perhaps just from the still air around me. It's never loud, never accompanied by cold spots or moving objects here. Just the hum. It feels familiar now, less frightening than deeply, profoundly unsettling. It's as if that quiet, scholarly presence, that lonely echo from the library's depths, having been disturbed or perhaps intrigued, has followed me home. Or perhaps it was never truly bound to the library, but to the act of quiet contemplation, the silent communion with words and history in the dead of night. It doesn't feel malevolent even now, just present. A quiet hum beneath the silence, a constant, gentle reminder that I am not entirely alone in my late night reading, and that knowledge is, in its own quiet way, more chilling than any loud fright could ever be.